Now, Nigeria's Voluntary Assets and Income Declaration Scheme, VADS, is a time-limited opportunity for taxpayers to regularize their status. The scheme has a deadline of the 31st of March this year, after which the tax authorities say they will come hard for defaulters. Chinwendu Enechi, the Senior Tax Manager for Oil and Gas and Power at Andersen Tax, joins me to discuss developments in Nigeria's tax space. Chinwendu, thank you so much. Pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So, I guess we can argue, and it's obvious that the authorities, fiscal authorities, the tax authorities, likes of the FIRS, have done a lot to boost the tax revenues in the country. But let's talk about where we are right now, especially with the VADS, which was the main tool, the main policy thrust, as it were, for 2017 to widen the tax bracket and bring in more revenues. Tell us what your assessment is in terms of how successful VADS has been so far.
Well, I think VADS has been very successful. I mean, the FIRS chairman did mention last year that to some extent they've met their target. So beyond just revenue, collection, it also give them an opportunity to increase the tax net, to bring in much more people who were, prior to VADS, were not paying taxes. So it's an avenue for them to also do some form of data mining, because at the end of the day, it's not just about collection today. It's how do you increase that collection? So it's giving them that opportunity to increase the tax net and bring in more people. So to some extent, it's been successful. So
there's a March 31st deadline now. And I know that at some point last year, towards the end of last year, the finance minister came out to say that they were able to compile a list of high net worth individuals who had assets abroad, undeclared assets abroad, and that they were going to embark on a name and shame and they were given a deadline. So I'm thinking, do you think that has been an effective tool, the threat of a name and shame, to get people to come forward and pay taxes?
Yeah, I think it has been, because we have some people are asking questions, asking their tax consultant, how does this work? So obviously people are getting a bit agitated. If you have assets that you haven't declared, or you have income you haven't declared, people are asking questions and going forward to declare their income and assets. So to some extent it's been working. I mean, the name and shame is working. I mean, the FIRS chairman did mention that they've given these individuals a deadline on when to come forward, and if that deadline expires, they'll go after them. So they have the information. They know the guys who have acquired some luxury items, some cars. They know where those cars were acquired, and they have a sense of how much taxes these individuals have paid. So if they don't come forward, the FIRS will go after them. So they have the information. Okay,
so we've seen revenues increase. We've seen the VADS scheme work to a large extent. But then looking at the tax to GDP ratio, that last year when the push came for increased tax drive was around 6%. But I understand that it's now below 6%, somewhere around 5%. So I'm thinking, isn't that a step back? What happened?
Well, it's a step back, because the question that one needs to ask is, yeah, VADS is here, but beyond VADS, what then happens? How do we increase the tax net? So to my mind, the government needs to focus on the informal sector, for instance. I mean, if you look at the informal sector, contributes over 50% to GDP. But when you come to tax numbers, it contributes little or nothing to tax revenue. So the government hasn't done much in that area, to ramp up tax collection from that area. But if staying away from the informal sector, we seem to have a very weak and inefficient collection, from the tax authorities, and so a bit needs to be done in that area to increase that collection.
Is it because I would imagine that the first place to start will be the identification process, to identify those who should pay tax first. And I suppose one easy way to do that is to have a data bank where people are registered into a central system, like the national identification. I don't know how many Nigerians are enrolled in that. I know they will also try to use the bank BVN. I know that was effective, but I'm not sure to what extent has this helped, or would this help there?
Well, it will help to a great deal, because I mean, with VADS, for instance, it's an opportunity for them to also get information about some taxpayers or unregistered taxpayers, and also bring them into the tax net. I know the FRA is also collaborating with the banks through the BVN to get data, and also to have certain transactions being reported to the FRS, for them to do a check. So that will help. Like I said, the FRS is doing some bit of data mining now, so is a step in the right direction. I know the tax GDP ratio has dropped, but I do see I see that going up, come the end of the year, given what the FRS is planning to do.
Do you think that it will be the same? Yes, I mean, hopefully that happens. But do you think it will be the same approach again this year? Because it would appear that it's easier to go after the wealthy. I mean, it's easier to identify where they are. I mean, like you said, BVN, just the banks can give you records of, money inflows and outflows, who's bought what and all of that. But I'm thinking for the man on the street, the SMEs who are in their own little corner somewhere, but still making, significant amount of money, but aren't paying tax because they're not part of some central system. Isn't it a lot harder to identify those?
Yeah, it's a lot harder to identify them. So what I think the FRS can do, or I mean the tax authority generally, this year what I see that will most likely happen is a lot of tax awareness around that area. Because one thing is, you need to even be sure that, you need to know that you need to pay taxes. The man on the street who has a kiosk, the man who has some little business here, may never think that they need to pay taxes. So some form of awareness needs to, needs to be done towards that area. So it's like it's got to be a process. So some awareness has to happen. You've got to let the taxpayers know how this can be done, how they need to remit their taxes, what they need to do, what form of registrations need to happen. So the FRS, the tax authorities, need to do a lot more in that area for them to get anything.
That being said, and within the awareness approach, I've heard some other tax analysts argue that there's still the trust deficit is still a huge problem. That no matter the amount of radio jingles, TV commercials you put out there, if the man is not convinced that, doesn't feel he's morally obligated to pay tax because maybe the roads in front of his house are bad, one leading to his business is bad, he has to pay so much money for power to run his business, and then at the end of the day he says, why do I pay tax? I'm a government unto myself. Sure. So how much of a problem do you see that being for the government this year? It's
a huge problem because, again, like you did mention, there's the man on the street needs to be convinced that their tax being paid are being used, to do the right thing. So some form of accountability needs to come from the government. So if the government wants to increase tax revenue from that area, they also need to be responsible. The government needs to come out to, begin to show that the money is being used for the right reasons. So we're hoping that, I mean, it's a two-way thing. You don't expect someone to hand over some amount of money and then the person is not sure what will happen. So we're hoping that that level of accountability and responsibility will come from the side of the government.
Now, before now, it would appear, maybe before the year 2017, 2016, it would appear that we had a very complicated tax policy and, the way everything was crafted. Do you think that it's a lot more simpler process now, easy to decipher for the average man to read and say, okay, I understand what the tax policy is and I understand that there are centers I can go to pay my tax. It's not one very complicated process anymore.
Yeah, I think it's a bit more simplified now. Now, sometime last year, we did have the national tax policy, which has now been simplified, if I may use that word, from what it used to be. Now, the FRS is trying as much as possible to make the compliance a bit easier for taxpayers. So this year, you're going to see a lot more. I mean, it started from last year. You're going to see a lot of e-filing, so the use of technology, basically, e-filing, e-registration, to ensure that you may not need to go to the FRS, to do any form of transaction. You can sit at the comfort of your office, and as long as you're registered, and do your transaction, file your tax return. So the FRS is looking to do that because, again, you need to make it convenient for taxpayers to do. If you want taxpayers to comply, you've got to, have a structure that makes it a lot easier for them to comply. So I see that a lot of that happening this year.
I know that at the time Nigeria decided to, at least the authorities decided to get more serious. I mean, when oil prices, really plunged and there was that real revenue pressure. That's when we began to see this tax drive. Would you say that Nigeria is learning from other examples outside of our shores? I know some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, likes of South Africa and some other countries, have tax to GDP ratios between 15 up to 24%. Are we learning from examples? Are there similar economies like us who have these issues and we're able to surmount them and then take their tax to GDP ratios higher?
Yeah, of course, we're learning, which is the reason why VAT, for instance, because tax it can be used as a tool for economic management and development. And one of the ways to do that is to maybe grant incentives, tax incentives, or some amnesty programs, just like the VATs. And what that does is it frees up cash for businesses to make further investment, from the incentive angle, for instance. And when you have more investment, it creates more transactions and it creates more employment. And when you have employment is a big issue in Nigeria, for instance. So when you have a lot of employed people, what that does is that it adds to the tax revenue because those people have to pay taxes. And also in the transactions that will happen from that investment, you have other transaction taxes that will be generated. So to some extent, we are learning from that, and I won't be surprised if we see similar amnesty programs or incentives. I mean, the government is huge on incentives.
You think the government will continue on that incentive path?
Because for you to be able to, we just came out of recession, and for you to maintain that economic growth, you've got to find a way to help companies that are just coming out of that recession to grow. And even dead companies, you've got to be able to find a way to help them, come upstream. And one of the ways to do that is to grant incentives to qualifying companies and be sure that, because they're going to have to do cost and benefit analysis, and be sure that the revenue loss from the tax incentive is being used, for the reasons why you've granted such incentives.
Do you think the penalties that attached to some, for defaulters, do you think they're effective enough?
Yeah, I think they are. I think they are.
Okay, because we hear, the LFIRS goes and it's closed up rounded up some companies and closed them up or slammed some fines on them. So I'm thinking, has that been effective? Did the companies come around and say, okay, we'll pay?
Yeah, because sometimes, in my experience, what I've seen is, if you get your office locked up for days or for weeks, you're going to lose revenue. And if you happen to be a company who has some foreign affiliation, nobody wants bad news. Yeah, so nobody wants their company being reported for tax evasion. So they know that things like that can push taxpayers to do what they need to do.
Right, Chinwendu, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you.
I've been speaking to Chinwendu Enechi, Senior Tax Manager for Oil, Gas and Power at Andersen Tax.